They say wounds must bleed to be real. They say pain must shout to be heard. But some of the deepest injuries never make a sound. They form quietly, invisibly, in dining rooms filled with laughter, in living rooms decorated with family photos, in homes that look perfect from the outside. Favoritism is not always loud. It does not always announce itself. It does not always arrive with cruelty. Sometimes it arrives with subtlety, a comparison disguised as motivation, a preference disguised as personality, a bias disguised as love. And in that subtlety, a child begins to understand something they were never meant to learn, that affection can be unequal, that approval can be selective, that love can feel earned rather than given. There is a particular loneliness that comes from standing in a room full of family and still feeling unseen. It is the loneliness of watching someone else receive the softness you craved, the patience you needed, the pride you hoped for. It is not jealousy. It is not hatred. It is a quiet confusion, a question that forms in the mind of a child. What is wrong with me? And that question, left unanswered, becomes a belief that follows them into adulthood like a shadow that never detaches. They grow up smiling, they grow up achieving, they grow up functioning, but deep within there is a scar, not visible to the eye but etched into identity. Favoritism does not only shape childhood, it shapes destiny. It influences confidence, relationships, ambition, and self-worth. It creates competitors where there should have been companions. It builds walls where there should have been warmth. And the tragedy is this: many never recognize it for what it is. They call it discipline. They call it personality differences. They call it normal. But normal does not mean harmless. And today, we are going to confront the invisible scar, not with anger, not with blame, but with clarity. Because what is unnamed cannot be healed, and what is understood can finally be released. The child who learned to be silent. Favoritism rarely announces itself with cruelty. It does not always arrive as open rejection or harsh words. More often, it moves quietly through ordinary moments. A longer conversation with one child, a softer defense when one makes a mistake, a brighter pride when one succeeds. And the other child notices. Oh, they notice everything. Children are observers long before they are speakers. They read tone before they understand vocabulary. They measure facial expressions before they comprehend logic. And slowly, without anyone declaring it, they begin to understand where they stand. Not at the center, not quite chosen, not entirely seen. At first, the response is subtle. They try harder. They behave better. They seek approval in small, careful ways. But when the scale never balances, something shifts. The child begins to withdraw, not dramatically, not rebelliously, quietly. They stop raising their hand at the dinner table. They swallow opinions before they reach the surface. They convince themselves that silence is safer than disappointment, because every time they reached outward and felt overlooked, it carved a small doubt inside them. And doubt, repeated often enough, becomes identity. This is where the invisible scar forms. It is not loud. It does not disrupt the household. In fact, the silent child is often praised for being mature, independent, low maintenance. But what looks like strength may actually be surrender. What looks like calm may actually be caution. The child learns to take up less space, emotionally, verbally, even physically. They sit smaller. Dream smaller, ask for less, because somewhere along the way they absorbed a dangerous lesson, that their needs are secondary, that their feelings are excessive, that their presence is negotiable. And silence, once learned in childhood, does not remain there. It matures with them. It follows them into classrooms where they know the answer but hesitate to speak, into friendships where they tolerate imbalance to avoid rejection, into workplaces where they overwork but under-advocate, into relationships where they love deeply but fear being replaced. The pattern is consistent. They shrink so others can expand. They adjust so others remain comfortable. They silence themselves before anyone else has the chance to. But here is the truth that often goes unspoken. The silent child was never weak. They were adaptive. They were surviving the only way they knew how. Silence was protection. Withdrawal was armor. Minimizing their needs was a strategy to avoid further pain. And while that strategy may have preserved peace in childhood, it becomes a prison in adulthood, because a voice unused grows uncertain, a heart unheard grows hesitant, and a person unseen begins to question whether they deserve to be fully visible at all. Favoritism may have shaped the environment, but it does not have to define the future. The child who learned to be silent can learn to speak, carefully at first, trembling perhaps, but steadily, because the scar may be invisible, yet the voice beneath it is still there, waiting not for permission, but for courage. The performance trap. When love feels uneven, the overlooked child makes a quiet decision. If affection is not given freely, it must be earned. And so begins the performance. Not the joyful performance of talent or passion, but the exhausting performance of worthiness. They begin to believe that excellence is the price of acceptance. Good grades are no longer achievements, they are offerings. Obedience is no longer character, it is strategy. Success is no longer ambition, it is survival. Every accomplishment carries a silent hope. Now will I be enough? This is the trap, because performance can win applause, but it cannot guarantee belonging. The child grows skilled at reading expectations. They anticipate needs before they are spoken. They become responsible beyond their years, mature beyond their age, disciplined beyond their peers, and the world praises them for it. Teachers admire them, relatives commend them, society rewards them, but inside, the engine driving them is not joy, it is hunger. Hunger for validation, hunger for fairness, hunger for the simple, steady reassurance that says, you matter without conditions. The tragedy of the performance trap is that it looks like success from the outside. The child becomes the high achiever, the reliable one, the strong one, but their identity becomes fused with output. Rest feels dangerous, failure feels catastrophic, mistakes feel like proof of what they feared all along, that without achievement they are replaceable. And so they push harder, they stretch further, they sacrifice sleep, peace, even authenticity, because slowing down would mean confronting a terrifying question. If I stop performing, will anyone stay? Over time, this pattern matures into adulthood. The performer becomes the overworker, the perfectionist, the one who says yes when they mean no. They enter relationships determined to be indispensable. They overgive, overfix, overfunction. They believe that love must be maintained through effort, through usefulness, through constant proving. And when appreciation fades, as it inevitably does in ordinary human relationships, panic sets in. Not because they lack strength, but because they were trained to equate love with performance. But love was never meant to be a stage. It was never meant to require an audition. True belonging does not fluctuate with achievement. It does not rise and fall with comparison. The child who was overlooked did not need to become extraordinary to deserve care. They already did. The awards, the discipline, the perfection, those were coping mechanisms, not identity. Breaking the performance trap requires something far more difficult than striving. It requires stillness. It requires allowing oneself to exist without proving, to rest without guilt, to fail without self-erasure, to understand that worth is inherent, not earned. And perhaps the most radical act for the former performer is this: to be seen without achievement attached. To say, this is who I am, without presenting a trophy. Because the moment performance stops being survival, achievement becomes freedom again, and love finally becomes something received, not something chased. The sibling rivalry that never ends. Favoritism does not only wound the overlooked child, it reshapes the entire family dynamic. It quietly turns companionship into competition. Where there should have been shared secrets, there are silent scoreboards. Where there should have been protection, there is comparison. The household becomes a stage, and siblings, who were meant to stand side by side, are placed unknowingly on opposite ends of an invisible scale. One is lifted, the other is measured, and neither fully understands why. The overlooked child begins to watch their sibling not with hatred, but with aching awareness. Every compliment feels like confirmation. Every defense feels like proof. Every celebration feels slightly uneven. And though they may love their brother or sister deeply, something complicated begins to grow. a tension that has nothing to do with personality and everything to do with positioning. It is difficult to feel secure in a bond when you believe you are competing for something as fundamental as affection. But the favored child carries a burden too, one rarely acknowledged. Being placed on a pedestal is not pure privilege, it is pressure. They are expected to maintain the image, to justify the preference, to uphold the role assigned to them. They may feel guilt they cannot articulate. They may sense resentment they did not ask for. And over time they learn that their worth is tied to staying exceptional. The pedestal, though elevated, is narrow and unstable. One misstep, and admiration can quickly turn into disappointment. Years pass. Childhood ends. But the pattern often remains. Family gatherings carry undercurrents that no one names. Conversations are polite but cautious. Achievements are shared carefully. Old comparisons echo in subtle ways. Who earns more, who married better, who visits more often. And beneath it all lies the original imbalance that was never addressed. The rivalry becomes less about toys and grades, and more about identity and recognition. What makes this dynamic so painful is that it was never the siblings' choice. Children do not design favoritism, they adapt to it, they survive within it. And in doing so, they sometimes lose the closeness they might have had. A brother who could have been an ally becomes a benchmark. A sister who could have been a confidant becomes a reminder, and both carry emotions they were never taught to process. Healing this rivalry requires courage, not confrontation filled with blame, but conversation filled with honesty. It requires recognizing that the true source of division was not the sibling standing across from you, but the imbalance that stood between you. It requires empathy on both sides, understanding that both the pedestal and the shadow can distort identity, because siblings were never meant to compete for love. Love was meant to be abundant, not rationed. And when adults choose to dismantle the silent scoreboards of their childhood, something powerful happens. Rivalry transforms into understanding. Distance softens into dialogue. And the bond that was strained by comparison can, with intention, become stronger than it ever was. The adult who doubts their worth. The child may grow taller, the voice may grow deeper, the responsibilities may multiply, but the invisible scar does not simply disappear with age. It matures, it adapts, it disguises itself in adult language, insecurity, overthinking, imposter syndrome, fear of rejection. What once began as a quiet question in childhood, "Why not me?" becomes a persistent whisper in adulthood, "Maybe I am not enough." And that whisper can shape an entire life. The adult who grew up in the shadow of favoritism often becomes highly self-aware, but not always self-assured. They enter rooms already measuring themselves against others. They scan conversations for signs of dismissal. They interpret neutral expressions as disapproval. It is not paranoia, it is conditioning. When you grow up feeling second, your nervous system learns to anticipate replacement. You become alert to shifts in tone, to subtle changes in energy, to any signal that suggests you are losing ground. Even when there is no competition, your mind creates one. In professional spaces, this doubt can look like relentless over-preparation. They work twice as hard to avoid being overlooked. They hesitate before claiming credit. They downplay achievements. Compliments feel temporary, as though they might be revoked. Success brings relief, but not security, because deep down they are still trying to prove something that should have been affirmed long ago. And when failure arrives, as it inevitably does for every human being, it does not feel like a mistake. It feels like confirmation of an old fear. In relationships, the pattern can be even more painful. They may love deeply, but cautiously. They give generously, but with quiet anxiety. If their partner seems distant, their mind fills in the worst possibilities. If conflict arises, they instinctively assume fault. They may tolerate imbalance longer than they should, believing that asking for more could risk losing everything. The fear is not simply abandonment, it is replacement. The old shadow returns, whispering that someone else might be chosen over them. What makes this struggle so complex is that from the outside, they often appear capable, composed, even confident. They have learned to function despite the doubt. They build careers, they maintain friendships, they meet expectations. But inside, there is a fragile place that still seeks reassurance, a part of them that longs to feel unquestionably valued, not because of what they do, but because of who they are. The path forward is not about erasing the past, it is about rewriting the interpretation of it. Favoritism may have shaped early experiences, but it does not define intrinsic worth. Worth was never something assigned by comparison. It was never a prize to be won. It was inherent from the beginning. The adult who doubts their worth must slowly practice a new narrative, one where validation is internal, not borrowed, one where mistakes are human, not proof of inadequacy, one where being chosen by others matters less than choosing oneself. Because healing begins the moment you stop auditioning for a place you already deserve, breaking the pattern. There comes a moment, quiet, almost unremarkable, when awareness dawns. Not anger, not rebellion, just clarity. A realization that the ache you have carried for years did not begin with you, that the insecurity, the overcompensating, the silence, the rivalry, these were responses to an imbalance you did not create. And in that realization lies something powerful, choice. Because while you may not have chosen the environment that shaped you, you can choose the pattern that continues. Breaking the pattern of favoritism is not about confronting the past with hostility. It is about confronting it with understanding. It is recognizing that those who showed preference may have been repeating what they themselves experienced. It is seeing the cycle without excusing the impact. And most importantly, it is deciding that the cycle will not pass through you unchanged. Awareness turns unconscious repetition into intentional transformation. The first shift is internal. You stop chasing validation from those who rationed it. You stop rehearsing conversations in your head, hoping to finally win approval that may never come. You release the exhausting need to outperform, to overgive, to overprove. Instead, you begin to anchor your worth in something steadier, your values, your character, your integrity. You understand that love cannot be forced through achievement and respect cannot be secured through self-erasure. The second shift is relational. If you become a parent, a mentor, a leader, you grow vigilant. You examine your language. You notice comparisons before they leave your mouth. You resist labeling one child as the smart one and another as the difficult one. You understand that even subtle distinctions can echo loudly in a young mind. You choose fairness not just in material things, but in attention, patience, and emotional presence, because you know firsthand how deeply imbalance can carve into identity. And then there is perhaps the most difficult shift of all, forgiveness, not necessarily reconciliation, not pretending the wound did not exist, but releasing the hold it has over your future. Carrying resentment may feel justified, but it binds you to the very pattern you are trying to escape. Forgiveness, in this context, is not about excusing behavior. It is about freeing yourself from living in constant reaction to it. Breaking the pattern is not dramatic. It will not always be applauded. It is often invisible, like the scar itself. It looks like pausing before comparison. It looks like speaking when you would once have stayed silent. It looks like celebrating others without measuring yourself against them. It looks like choosing self-respect over performance, small decisions, repeated consistently until a new legacy is formed. And one day, you will notice something remarkable. The shadow that once defined you no longer follows so closely. The need to compete softens. The urge to prove quiets. You stand not as the overlooked child, nor as the performer, nor as the rival, but as an individual who has reclaimed their narrative. The scar may remain as part of your story, but it no longer directs the plot. And in that freedom, the pattern ends, not with bitterness, but with strength.